Marcus's voice hit me before I even stepped out of the car. "This vehicle's a violation, Whitaker. Park it here again, and the board will fine you $500 a day." He stood at the edge of my driveway, clipboard pressed to his chest like a badge of authority, his smug smile catching the porch light. My wife was halfway up the walk, one hand on her stomach, the other fumbling for her keys. He angled his body toward her, as if she were the criminal. I felt the shift in the air before I said a word. "You might want to check the bylaws again, Marcus," I answered evenly, stepping out and shutting the door behind me. "Because the authority you're waving around doesn't exist, not the way you think." For the first time, his pen froze mid-scribble. He hadn't expected resistance, not here, not tonight. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't have to. "My name's Daniel Whitaker, federal judge, and I've spent my life dismantling cases built on sand. You'd be smart to stop pouring." His smile faltered, but he covered it quickly, shuffling his papers as if they might shield him. I could almost see the gears grinding in his head, trying to square the image of a quiet neighbor with the man standing in front of him now. I let my eyes rest on the car he was pointing at. The midnight blue paint caught the glow of the street lamp, throwing a sheen across the hood. That car wasn't just metal, it was my father's final gift. He'd rebuilt it in the last year of his life, knuckles bloodied, lungs failing, telling me every weekend, "Keep it running, son. One day your kids will need to know where they came from." When the engine finally roared to life, it was the closest I'd heard him come to laughter since his diagnosis. Now it sat in my driveway like a monument, a heartbeat of family history no rulebook could erase. Rachel's fingers tightened around her keys. She didn't speak, but the way she glanced at me was enough. The pregnancy had already drained her strength. This confrontation was the last thing she needed. I caught the sharp tang of fear in the air, the kind that clings when someone smaller is cornered by power misused. And in that moment, Marcus's clipboard wasn't just paper, it was a weapon. I'd seen this pattern before, not in cul-de-sacs or manicured lawns, but in courtrooms where confidence masks corruption, where bluster hides weakness. Marcus thrived on intimidation, and tonight he thought he'd won before the bell had even rung. But he didn't know me. "Where are you watching from?" I ask you, because every neighborhood has a Marcus, the one who mistakes control for leadership. And every Marcus eventually learns that authority has boundaries, especially when it tangles with the law. I took a step closer, lowering my voice until it carried only to him. "You've chosen the wrong driveway, the wrong family, and the wrong man to test. This isn't going to end the way you think." The night hummed with crickets, a faint ripple of water from the lake beyond the houses. Neighbors lingered behind curtains, shadows shifting against glass, unwilling to show themselves, but too curious to turn away. They'd seen Marcus pull this stunt before, seen him corner families with petty fines and threats of foreclosure. What they hadn't seen, what they were about to see, was someone who wouldn't bow. I felt Rachel's hand brush mine, a small anchor in the storm. Her grip was shaky, but her eyes held steady. For her, for my father, for the life we were building, I wasn't going to let Marcus's authority stand unchecked. Marcus shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and held his clipboard higher, as if it could block the truth pressing down on him. But I saw it then. The hesitation in his jaw, the crack in the facade. And that was all I needed, because a man who hesitates in the open will crumble in the dark. He thought tonight was a skirmish. What he didn't realize was that he'd started a war. And I never lose wars fought on the law. He thought tonight was a skirmish. What he didn't realize was that he'd started a war, and the echoes of that war carried past my driveway into the heart of Lakeshore Estates. By morning, whispers traveled faster than lawn sprinklers. Neighbors who had pretended not to see last night's confrontation now spoke of it in hushed voices on their porches, or while pushing strollers along the winding sidewalks. Marcus had drawn a line in my driveway, but everyone knew his clipboard had hovered over theirs too. When I left for court the next day, the neighborhood looked different. It wasn't the manicured lawns or the pristine lakefront that caught my eye. It was the way people averted their gaze. Some gave me small nods of respect, the kind you'd offer to someone who'd stood where you didn't dare. Others turned their faces, afraid Marcus might spot them showing allegiance. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, but beneath it lay tension, sharp as ozone before a storm. By mid-afternoon, the HOA office buzzed like a hive. It was nothing more than a repurposed leasing suite by the clubhouse, walls lined with framed photos of community pride events. The desk assistant glanced up nervously as I entered, her fingers tightening around a pen. She knew my title now. Word had spread, and though she smiled, it carried the stiffness of someone who feared she was being watched. Marcus's door was closed, but voices leaked through the glass, sharp, clipped, self-assured. He was meeting with board members, fanning his version of last night's events like wildfire. According to his script, I wasn't a man protecting his wife and family's legacy. I was an unruly neighbor, defying authority. His narrative had power here, at least for now, because repetition often masquerades as truth. I didn't barge in. I didn't need to. I stood long enough to hear the word example in his tone, and that was enough. Marcus wanted me broken publicly, not just fined privately. That wasn't enforcement. It was theater. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. The first casualty of that theater wasn't me. It was the community. 2 houses down, the Johnsons had a swing set tagged for removal because its paint didn't match the HOA's approved palette. Across the cul-de-sac, an elderly widow had racked up fines for flower pots deemed excessive. These weren't isolated acts. They were part of Marcus's script: create fear, enforce compliance, tighten control. And it worked because most people didn't know the law the way I did. But now, they were watching. That night, Rachel and I walked along the lakefront path, her arm hooked through mine for balance. The water reflected the street lamps in trembling lines, broken every so often by the splash of a carp surfacing. She kept her voice low, though we were alone. "They're scared of him, Daniel, even the ones who hate him." She stopped, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly. "They don't see a way out." I did. But it wasn't time yet. The strategy I carried wasn't built on outrage or petitions. It was built on law, on the cracks in Marcus's foundation that he didn't realize were visible to someone trained to see. His threats, his fines, his so-called authority, all of it hinged on procedures that had to be airtight, and I'd already seen the loose threads dangling. I thought back to the moment his pen froze when I mentioned his authority. That hesitation hadn't been just arrogance checked. It was uncertainty revealed. He wasn't as sure of his bylaws as he pretended. That was my lever. The neighborhood's pain was real, but it was also useful. Every overreach, every misuse of fines, every intimidation created a pattern I could trace and present with precision. One case might be dismissed as petty, but a string of them, all resting on the same flimsy authority, that was a house of cards begging for collapse. As Rachel and I turned back toward home, porch lights flickered on one by one. Shadows of neighbors lingered by their windows, watching, measuring. They weren't ready to stand beside me yet, but the thought had crossed their minds. And in Marcus's world, doubt was the first crack in obedience. The air cooled as night deepened, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant honeysuckle. I let it steady me, reminding me why I was here. Not just for myself, not even just for Rachel and our child, but for every person in this neighborhood who had been silenced by intimidation. Marcus thought his clipboard gave him power, but power built on fear collapses the moment someone refuses to flinch. And I didn't flinch. I didn't flinch, and that refusal carried me into the next morning. By the time sunlight stretched across Lakeshore Estates, Marcus had already spread his version of events. He painted me as combative, reckless, a man unwilling to respect community order. The word order carried through the neighborhood like gospel, and most people whispered it with resignation. But one person's silence lingered differently. I noticed her outside the clubhouse later that day. Susan Alvarez, HOA secretary, arms folded tight across her chest as though bracing herself against a storm. She stood by the notice board, pinning up yet another round of violation slips. The wind tugged at her hair, but it wasn't the breeze that made her hand tremble. It was the weight of what she was posting. I approached slowly, not wanting to spook her. The sharp tang of chlorine drifted from the pool behind us, mixing with the sound of kids splashing. a strange backdrop to the tension knotting between us. She didn't look at me at first, just pressed a notice flat with the palm of her hand. "You don't have to do this," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away, scanning the path for Marcus. "You don't understand. He'll find out I talked to you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, brittle but heavy. That was all I needed to know. She wasn't loyal, she was afraid. And fear meant she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. "I understand more than you think," I told her. I didn't press, didn't demand. I'd learned long ago that truth from a reluctant witness was coaxed, not forced. She turned then, finally meeting my gaze. There was something behind her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying someone else's secrets too long. "He said last night would be an example," she murmured, voice breaking around the edges. "He doesn't care if people get hurt, Daniel. He just wants to be feared." The words cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just me he targeted, or my wife, or my father's car. This was systemic, engineered cruelty dressed up as policy. And Susan, trapped inside his circle, was both enforcer and prisoner. I nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time he learned what fear really feels like. Her breath hitched. For a moment she looked like she might answer, but the clubhouse door swung open. Marcus's laugh carried out, sharp and performative, and Susan flinched. She shoved the last notice onto the board and walked away quickly, head down, leaving me staring at the papers fluttering in the breeze. Each slip was another family marked, another line crossed. But to me, they were something else, a record of abuse, proof. And proof, in the hands of a judge, was the beginning of the end. That night, Rachel sat with me on the porch, her hand resting on her belly. The cicadas had started their evening chorus, their shrill hum buzzing over the lake's stillness. "She's scared," Rachel said softly. She'd seen Susan too. But she looked like she wanted to help. "She will," I replied. "Fear doesn't last forever. It either breaks you or pushes you to act." The vintage car gleamed faintly under the porch light, a silent reminder of why I couldn't let this go. My father had built more than an engine. He'd built resolve. Every threat Marcus issued was another chance to honor that legacy. And now Susan's trembling hands had given me something more. Confirmation that Marcus's power wasn't as solid as he wanted everyone to believe. Inside the house, I pulled out a legal pad. Not because I needed notes, I already knew the law inside out, but because patterns emerge when you lay things out in ink. Fines without quorum, violations without precedent, a committee without proper incorporation. Marcus's empire wasn't built on authority. It was built on sand. Susan hadn't given me evidence yet, not directly. But her fear was a map, and I knew how to read it. Somewhere inside her was the key that would unravel him completely. For now, I let the night settle around me. Porch lights blinked on across the street, silhouettes moving in windows, neighbors peering out, but never stepping forward. They were waiting to see if I'd be crushed like the others. What they didn't realize was that Marcus had already made his mistake. He'd forced his secretary into silence, but silence is fragile. It cracks under the weight of conscience. And when Susan finally broke hers, I'd be ready. And when Susan finally broke hers, I'd be ready. But Marcus wasn't waiting around for cracks to appear. He escalated before the dust had even settled. By the weekend, the Whitaker name was plastered across the HOA's latest newsletter, slipped into every mailbox like a summons. The heading read, "Community Integrity at Risk," in bold letters. And underneath, Marcus wrote a thinly veiled tirade about one resident's defiance endangering property values. He never used my name outright, but everyone knew who he meant. The Lake Pavilion was where the newsletter landed hardest. Families gathered there every Saturday morning, fishermen with their gear, kids chasing each other down the dock, neighbors sipping coffee from thermoses. That morning, the pavilion buzzed with tension. Copies of Marcus's letter lay scattered across picnic tables, edges curling in the damp air, coffee stains soaking into his accusations. I stood on the deck, watching how people handled the paper. Some read it with furrowed brows, others folded it quickly, ashamed to be caught holding it. A few muttered under their breath about troublemakers and unnecessary drama. Marcus had struck where he knew it would sting, people's fear of losing money. In a neighborhood like Lakeshore Estates, property value wasn't just pride, it was currency. Rachel sat beside me, one hand steady on her belly, the other crumpling our copy of the letter. Her voice shook, though it wasn't fear, it was anger. He's trying to isolate us, make sure nobody stands with us. He's trying, I agreed, scanning the faces around us. But even in the mix of judgment and silence, I caught flickers of doubt. A father at the far table shook his head while reading. An older woman muttered, "He can't do this forever." Marcus's words carried weight, but not everyone was swallowing them whole. That was his mistake. Drawing attention to me meant drawing scrutiny to himself. The louder he shouted, the more I listened for the cracks. As the morning stretched on, Marcus himself appeared. He strolled across the pavilion like a man campaigning for office, smiling, shaking hands, patting shoulders. When his gaze found me, the smile turned sharp, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby ears. Some neighbors believe they're above the rules. That kind of arrogance threatens us all. The words weren't meant for me. They were aimed at the crowd. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I looked past him to the lake, its surface rippling under a soft breeze, calm, steady, inevitable. Rachel squeezed my hand, whispering, "They're listening to him." "Not all of them," I murmured back, because I saw Susan then, standing a few feet behind Marcus. She clutched a folder against her chest, eyes darting between him and me. Her lips pressed tight, as though holding back words that might burn if they escaped. She wasn't ready yet, but she was closer. The rest of the day, Marcus doubled down. Notices appeared on doors. New safety violations written in his handwriting. He was blanketing the community, building momentum, and trying to bury me under the avalanche. But what he didn't realize was that every new notice he taped up without proper approval only added to the ledger of illegitimacy. That evening, Rachel and I walked back from the pavilion. The air smelled of charcoal grills and lake water, laughter echoing faintly from across the shore. But under the warmth of a summer night, I felt the cold edges of resolve settling in. Marcus thought he was isolating me, but what he was really doing was piling evidence onto my side of the scale. The law was clear. For an HOA to issue binding fines, every board action had to follow procedure, quorum votes, official records, incorporated committees. Marcus had none of it. He was improvising authority, dressing it up in official fonts and letterheads. To the untrained eye, it looked legitimate. To mine, it was paper thin. Susan's silence weighed on me, but so did her trembling hands. She'd be the one to tip the balance. I was certain of it now. Until then, I'd let Marcus bury himself in his own overreach. As we reached home, the vintage car gleamed in the driveway, untouched, unyielding. It was more than just a target now. It was a mirror. Marcus saw it and saw defiance. I saw it and remembered my father's promise, never let anyone strip us of our dignity. And dignity once defended has a way of spreading. Dignity once defended has a way of spreading. That truth carried me into Monday morning when I found myself standing inside the county courthouse, not in my own courtroom, but in the records wing tucked behind marble corridors. The air there always smelled faintly of ink and dust, like a library that had never been allowed to sleep. Clerks bustled past with stacks of files, their shoes clicking against the tile in sharp rhythm. This wasn't where Marcus expected me to be. He believed I'd spend my energy arguing with neighbors on front lawns, not tracing his power back to its source. But I knew better. Paper trails don't lie. I approached the counter, sliding a request form forward with calm precision. Articles of Incorporation, Lakeshore Estates, HOA, I said. The clerk barely looked up, just nodded and disappeared into the shelves. Minutes later, she returned with a thin file that looked far too light for an organization wielding so much authority. I carried it to a side table and opened it. The fluorescent lights above hummed, washing the pages in sterile glow. And then I saw it, the first thread in Marcus's unraveling tapestry. Their incorporation had been filed, yes, but their amendments hadn't been properly recorded. Committees listed in glossy newsletters, the Safety Enforcement Division Marcus loved to invoke, didn't exist in any legally binding form. Without amendments on record, every notice, every fine, every threat was little more than bluff dressed in official ink. The victory strategy had just moved from theory to evidence. I leaned back in the chair, letting the revelation settle. My father used to tell me, "Son, power is only as strong as the paper it's written on." Here, under the courthouse lights, that lesson echoed. Marcus's entire empire rested on unfiled paperwork. To the untrained, it was invisible. To me, it was fatal. As I closed the file, I noticed movement a few tables over. A woman, mid-40s, professional, sharp eyes, was flipping through a stack of unrelated housing records. She glanced at me once, then twice, recognition dawning. It was one of our neighbors, a realtor named Diane, who'd been at the pavilion the day before. She caught sight of the Lakeshore file and raised a brow. "He's overstepping, isn't he?" she murmured. I didn't confirm, didn't deny. But her quiet observation told me what I needed to know. Marcus's cracks were visible to more than just me. The community was beginning to sense the hollowness. By the time I left the courthouse, the weight of evidence rested firmly in my hand, a certified copy of the incomplete incorporation. Proof that Marcus's authority was more performance than law. Proof that, in a courtroom, his empire wouldn't stand. That evening, Rachel and I sat at the dining room table, the file spread between us. The warm glow of the chandelier couldn't soften the chill of what we were reading. She brushed her fingers across the stamped dates, her eyes tightening. "So, all those fines, all those threats, illegal," I said simply, "void from the start." She leaned back, exhaling slowly, relief mixing with disbelief. "Do you think the others will believe it?" "They won't have to believe," I replied. "They'll see it." Outside, the cicadas hummed again, but this time I felt their chorus differently. Less like static noise, more like a warning drumbeat. Marcus had escalated with newsletters and notices, but now I had something far stronger. The law doesn't shout, it waits. And when it speaks, it silences everything else. I tucked the documents back into their envelope and slid it beneath my arm. The pages felt light, but I knew the weight they carried. Marcus thought fear was unshakable currency, but he'd forgotten the one truth I'd built my life on. Fear dissolves in the face of fact. The next move wasn't about me anymore. It was about showing the neighborhood what I'd seen under those courthouse lights. Because once they saw, there'd be no going back. Because once they saw, there'd be no going back. I carried that envelope like a weapon, though I didn't unsheath it right away. Timing mattered. Marcus had spent years weaving his control into the fabric of this neighborhood, and if I swung too early, he'd bury me under another avalanche of fear. But, as fate would have it, he handed me the opportunity himself. The HOA scheduled a mandatory community compliance check at the recreation center, a thin disguise for another round of intimidation. By dusk, the gymnasium echoed with the scrape of folding chairs and the low murmur of uneasy voices. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting the room in cold white glare. Neighbors filled row after row, eyes darting toward the podium where Marcus stood, clipboard in hand, flanked by two board members who nodded like marionettes. Rachel sat beside me, her hand resting on her stomach, her expression a mask of calm determination. The vintage car was parked safely at home, gleaming under our porch light, but it loomed in my mind as clearly as if it were parked in the gym itself. Every false violation Marcus pushed against it was another insult to my father's memory, another strike against our dignity. Marcus cleared his throat, and the chatter died. "We've had a troubling rise in noncompliance," he began, voice smooth but sharpened at the edges. "Violations ignored, warnings dismissed. If we allow this to continue, Lakeshore Estates will lose the value and prestige we've worked so hard to maintain." His gaze slid across the crowd and landed squarely on me. We all know what happens when one family believes the rules don't apply to them. The crowd stirred uneasily. A few people nodded, others glanced down at their laps. Fear, again, did its work. I let him finish his speech, let him enjoy the illusion of power. Then, when the murmurs softened, I rose slowly to my feet. The scrape of my chair echoed louder than his entire performance. "Marcus," I said evenly, "before you go any further, maybe you should explain which rules you're talking about, because I've checked twice, and it turns out most of the ones you're enforcing don't actually exist." A ripple passed through the room. Some gasped, others frowned. Marcus's smile faltered, but he caught it quickly, tapping his pen against the clipboard. Don't spread misinformation, Daniel. The board's authority is well established. Is it? I asked, holding up the envelope. Because what I found at the courthouse this morning says otherwise. Committees you claim exist don't. Amendments you cite were never filed. Legally, every notice you've handed out is as worthless as the paper it's printed on. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide, whispers breaking out like sparks. For the first time, Marcus looked smaller behind his podium, his confidence dented in full view of the community he thrived on, intimidating. Rachel's hand found mine, steady, grounding. I could feel her pulse quicken, but her eyes held steady on Marcus. She wasn't just watching me fight. She was part of the reason I wouldn't stop. Susan Alvarez sat 3 rows ahead, her shoulders rigid, her hands gripping the folder in her lap so tightly her knuckles whitened. She didn't turn, didn't speak, but I saw the war in her posture. She knew I was right. And the longer Marcus sputtered without an answer, the more her silence tilted toward breaking. He tried to recover, spouting vague lines about interpretations and internal authority. But the damage was done. The crowd had seen him stutter. They'd heard my words, and once doubt creeps into fear, it never leaves the same. When the meeting adjourned, people didn't rush to him the way they usually did. They lingered in clusters, whispering, some daring to glance at me with cautious hope. I didn't need applause. Their hesitation was victory enough for now. Walking out into the night air, Rachel squeezed my arm. "You cracked him." "Not enough," I murmured, watching the neighbors disperse. Porch lights flickered on across the street like watchful eyes. But enough to make them start asking questions. And questions, I knew, were the beginning of rebellion. The night after the compliance meeting, the house felt heavier than usual. Rachel had gone to bed early, exhaustion pulling her under, but I stayed awake in the study. The courthouse documents sat on my desk, their stamped seals catching the faint glow of the lamp. They were powerful, yes, but they weren't complete. Evidence without testimony is a blade without a handle. It cuts, but it doesn't control. That was when the knock came. 3 hesitant raps, quick and uneven. I rose, heart tightening in my chest, and opened the door to find Susan Alvarez standing on the porch. The dim porch light cast her face in shadow, but even then I could see the turmoil written in her eyes. She clutched a folder tight against her chest, the same way I'd seen her hold papers at the pavilion. "Can I come in?" she asked, voice low, glancing over her shoulder as though Marcus himself might be lurking behind the hedges. I stepped aside, letting her cross the threshold. The scent of lake water clung to her clothes, and her hands trembled as she set the folder down on the table. She didn't sit until I did, and even then, she perched on the edge of the chair like someone ready to flee. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, staring down at her clasped hands. "If Marcus finds out—" Her words trailed off, caught between fear and resolve. "You already know he will," I said gently. "The question is whether you want to keep being part of his shadow." Her shoulders sagged. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Then she exhaled, the breath shuddering as though she'd been holding it for years. "You're right. And I can't keep doing this, not after what he did to your wife, not after what I've seen." She opened the folder. Inside were copies of board communications, letters Marcus had dictated but never filed, notices he'd ordered without quorum votes, and tucked between them was something more damning. A handwritten note from Marcus himself, instructions to escalate enforcement on the Whitakers as an example to others. I leaned forward, scanning the pages, every line confirming what I'd suspected. "You kept these." Her eyes flicked to mine, wide with shame. At first, because I was afraid. I thought if I held on to proof, maybe one day. I don't know, maybe I'd need it. But then it just became a weight I couldn't put down. Her voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, Daniel. But Marcus, he doesn't care who he crushes as long as people obey." The confession hit harder than the papers themselves. It wasn't just about me anymore. Marcus had weaponized the HOA against his own community, twisting neighbors into instruments of fear. Susan hadn't been an accomplice by choice. She'd been conscripted. I placed a hand on the folder, grounding it, grounding her. "You've done the hardest part already. You came here. You chose to stop hiding." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, jaw tightening. If I testify, if I admit I was part of it, he'll ruin me. My job, my home, my family, everything. You're not the one on trial, I said firmly. He is. And once the law sees this, he won't have the power to ruin anyone anymore. For the first time, a flicker of relief crossed her face, fragile but real. She sat back, shoulders loosening as though a weight had finally shifted. I'm scared, she admitted softly. Good, I answered. That means you understand the stakes, but you won't be standing alone. The clock ticked on. Outside, the cicadas droned, the lake breeze rattling the porch railings. Susan closed the folder and pushed it toward me, her hands steady now. Then take it. Do what I couldn't. I accepted the folder, the evidence settling into my hands like the missing piece of a puzzle. For weeks, Marcus had relied on fear to keep his control intact. But fear, once broken, becomes something else entirely, courage. And Susan Alvarez, trembling though she was, had just shifted the balance. When she left that night, I watched her walk down the path, with her head a little higher than before. The neighborhood wasn't free yet, but the tide had turned, and Marcus Greer had no idea the first stone in his empire had just been pulled loose. The folder Susan left behind sat on my desk like a loaded weapon. I didn't rush to open it again that night. I let it rest there, its weight enough to remind me what had changed. Marcus's empire had always seemed monolithic from the outside, but now I knew its cracks weren't just legal. They were moral. Susan's courage was proof that fear could be broken, and once broken, it spread. By morning, I carried the folder to a new place, my chambers at the federal courthouse. The heavy oak walls and shelves lined with precedent weren't foreign to me. They were home. This was where my mind sharpened, where I had spent decades stripping false authority down to its bones. Here, away from the neighborhood's whispers, I could lay out Marcus's pretenses under the cold light of law. I spread the documents across the polished desk. The fluorescent buzz of the courthouse faded into silence as I read line after line. Letters without votes, notices without signatures, entire committees that existed only in Marcus's handwriting. Susan's folder didn't just confirm the absence of authority, it mapped the deliberate deception. And the note about my family, that specific instruction to escalate enforcement, turned the whole matter from negligence into malice. I pressed my palms flat on the desk, letting the texture of the paper ground me. My father had fought to keep our family's dignity intact through decades of struggle. Now, here I was, his son, fighting the same battle. Only this time, with the tools of the law. The strategy was taking shape. It wasn't enough to prove Marcus lacked standing. I needed to show the community how every action he took was void. Fear worked because people believed his threats could stick. Once they realized those threats were nothing but ink on unfiled paper, his hold would shatter. Still, preparation mattered. I couldn't simply walk into the next meeting and announce his downfall. I needed to be meticulous. I needed to prepare the record as if I were already in front of a judge. Not Marcus's neighbors, but the kind of judge who wouldn't hesitate to strip him of authority entirely. I started drafting outlines. On one sheet, I listed every improper notice. On another, I highlighted the discrepancies in procedure. Susan's folder filled the gaps I couldn't prove with courthouse records alone. Together, they told a story not of sloppy governance, but of calculated abuse. As I worked, I felt the faint thrum of anxiety give way to clarity. Each line of evidence was another stone placed into the foundation of what would come next. Marcus believed he could intimidate me into silence, but intimidation is powerless against preparation. That afternoon, I stepped out into the courthouse atrium. The tall windows flooded the hall with light, the marble floor gleaming like water. For a moment, I stood there and let the sunlight hit my face, steadying my breath. I wasn't just fighting for my driveway anymore. I was preparing to dismantle a structure that had crushed more than just me. On my way back home, the neighborhood seemed different again. Children rode bikes down the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing across the pavement. Neighbors glanced up as I passed. Some still looked away quickly, but others held their gaze just long enough to acknowledge it. Doubt was spreading. They didn't know the details, but they sensed the shift. At home, Rachel met me at the door. Her eyes flicked to the envelope under my arm. You've got everything you need, don't you? Almost, I said. Now it's about showing it the right way. She smiled faintly, though her hand lingered on her stomach, as if to remind me of the stakes. Do it soon, Daniel, before he pushes anyone else too far. Her words echoed long after she'd gone inside. She was right. Marcus wouldn't stop escalating until he was stopped. And now I had both the law and a witness to bring him down. That night, under the steady hum of the porch light, I reviewed the documents one more time. The car gleamed in the driveway, silent and unyielding, a reflection of the fight I was carrying forward. Marcus thought he was untouchable. Soon he'd learn he was standing on nothing at all. Marcus thought he was standing on solid ground. What he didn't realize was that every step he took was already sinking into quicksand. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was ready to take the next move. Preparation wasn't just about gathering papers. It was about building a case so airtight that even the whisper of doubt could topple his authority. I carried Susan's folder and the courthouse documents with me to a new setting. Diane's real estate office on Main Street. The glass door swung shut behind me, muffling the sound of weekend traffic outside. Inside, the place smelled faintly of fresh paint and printer ink. A clean, clinical environment where numbers and contracts ruled. It was the perfect place to sharpen the edges of what I was building. Diane greeted me with a raised eyebrow, pushing aside a stack of housing listings. "You've been busy," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been at the compliance meeting, had seen Marcus falter under pressure. She didn't ask to see the folder. I offered it to her without a word. She flipped through the pages, her practiced eyes moving quickly, trained to spot details in deeds and closing documents. After only a few minutes, she let out a low whistle. This isn't sloppy paperwork. This is negligence. And negligence this consistent, it looks intentional. That was the validation I needed. A witness could give me credibility, but a professional, someone who understood property law and filings, gave me reinforcement. Together, Susan's confession and Diane's expertise built a bridge between fear and truth. I leaned against the edge of her desk, arms crossed, watching her sort the papers into piles. "I'll need you to confirm what you see here, if it comes to it," I said. Diane met my eyes. There was no hesitation, only quiet conviction. I've lived under his thumb long enough. If this is what it takes to put an end to it, I'm in. With that, the preparation shifted from private to collective. No longer was it my word against Marcus's bluster. Now there were layers. Witness, expert, record. Each one added weight, and Marcus didn't even realize the scale was tipping. That night, I brought everything back to the dining table. The chandelier glowed above as Rachel moved quietly around the kitchen, her presence steady, grounding me. I laid out the documents in 3 columns: record evidence, witness testimony, professional validation. Each column was a pillar, and together they formed the foundation of a case that couldn't be ignored. As I organized, I thought about the neighbors who had been fined, threatened, humiliated. I remembered the swing set tagged for removal, the flower pots labeled excessive, the chalk drawings my daughter had once made on the sidewalk years ago before Marcus turned joy into violation. Each memory fueled the structure I was building. This wasn't just my fight, it was theirs too. Rachel joined me at the table, resting a hand on her belly as she studied the piles of paper. "It's airtight," she said softly. "It has to be," I replied. "Marcus will try to spin this as noise, but once the community sees it lined up like this, there won't be anywhere for him to run." The preparation wasn't only about what I had, it was about how I would deliver it. Marcus had mastered intimidation by controlling the stage. Newsletters, notices, public meetings. If I wanted to undo him, I had to meet him on his stage and flip the script. That meant the next board meeting would be the battlefield. Before turning in for the night, I slid the papers into a leather briefcase. The weight of it felt solid, heavy, final. This wasn't about bluster anymore. It was about law, and the law was on my side. I stepped onto the porch one last time, before bed. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, crickets humming in steady chorus. Across the cul-de-sac, I saw a curtain shift. Neighbors watching, always watching, measuring. They didn't know it yet, but the preparation was done. The storm was coming, and for once, it wasn't Marcus holding the thunder. The storm was coming, and for once, it wasn't Marcus holding the thunder. The next board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday night at the community clubhouse. By the time Rachel and I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. Porch lights across the neighborhood had gone dark earlier than usual, neighbors streaming here instead of lingering by windows. The glow of the clubhouse spilled across the manicured lawn, but the air carried a weight that no landscaping could soften. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a trial than a meeting. Rows of folding chairs faced the front, where Marcus and the board sat, elevated on a low stage, their table neatly arranged with clipboards, binders, and pitchers of water. Marcus wore the same smug smile he always carried in public, his confidence rehearsed. His eyes locked on me the second I walked in, and for the briefest moment, that smile wavered. He saw the briefcase in my hand. Rachel guided herself to a chair near the front, her hand resting on her belly, eyes fixed straight ahead. Her presence was deliberate, visible proof of the stakes Marcus had ignored. Neighbors filled the room around us, murmurs rising and falling like the tide. Some leaned forward, expectant. Others sat stiffly, afraid of being seen siding with the wrong man. Marcus tapped his gavel, the sound sharp against the low ceiling. This meeting of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association is now in session. His voice carried too smoothly, rehearsed for authority. He launched into an agenda about landscaping, pool maintenance, and the pressing issue of compliance. It was all designed to set a stage of control, but I didn't miss the way his eyes flicked toward me after every sentence. When the floor opened for discussion, I rose. The scrape of my chair against the floor sent a ripple through the room. Neighbors shifted in their seats, waiting. Marcus straightened, pretending calm, though I saw the tension in his jaw. "I have questions," I began, voice steady. I set the briefcase on the table beside me and flipped it open. The sound of the latch snapped like a verdict, specifically about the authority under which this board claims to act. Marcus leaned forward, voice dripping with false patience. "Mr. Whitaker, you're free to voice your concerns, but I assure you, the board's authority is unquestionable. This community was built on rules you've chosen to ignore." I pulled out the first document, holding it where everyone could see the stamped seal of the courthouse. "You say unquestionable, I say incomplete. According to county records, the Articles of Incorporation for this HOA were never properly amended, which means the so-called Safety Enforcement Committee, the same one used to fine and threaten this community, does not legally exist." A hush fell over the room. Papers rustled. A woman in the second row let out a sharp gasp. Marcus's face flushed, but he forced a smile. "Technicalities," he scoffed. "The intent is clear, and the community has always accepted it." I laid down the second page, Susan's copy of an unfiled directive. Intent doesn't replace law. This letter, written in your own hand, proves not only that you invented enforcement without authority, but that you targeted specific families to make an example. That is abuse of office, not governance. Every head turned toward Marcus. Even his board members shifted uncomfortably. Susan herself sat 2 rows back, eyes lowered but shoulders squared. She didn't need to speak. The papers spoke for her. For a moment, Marcus floundered. His pen tapped nervously against the table. "These are confidential documents, taken without permission." "Wrong," I cut in. "These are records of actions taken outside your legal authority, which means they're evidence." I paused, letting the silence deepen. Evidence I am fully prepared to present in court. The room seemed to hold its breath. Behind me, I felt Rachel's presence like an anchor. Ahead of me, Marcus's carefully crafted image of control cracked under the weight of law. Neighbors began whispering louder, some openly questioning him now. Is that true? Can they even do that? Fear was dissolving, replaced by something stronger. Doubt. Marcus slammed his gavel again, desperate to reassert control. "This meeting is adjourned," he barked, voice cracking. But the damage was done. The neighbors had seen, the board had heard. And Marcus, for the first time, looked like a man standing alone. The meeting hadn't ended when Marcus slammed his gavel. If anything, that sound was the spark that lit the room. His declaration of adjournment hung hollow in the air, ignored by the rows of neighbors who remained seated, murmuring louder now, no longer afraid to let their voices rise. The clubhouse was supposed to be his stage, but the moment had shifted. He was no longer leading it, he was trapped in it. I stayed standing, the briefcase still open at my side. I didn't need to shout. The quiet weight of my words carried. You can't silence this meeting, Marcus, not when the law has already spoken louder than your gavel. A man in the back rose, voice shaking with long-held anger. My wife and I have paid fines for years, flower pots, a bird bath, even the color of our shutters. Are you saying none of that was legal? I turned toward him, meeting his eyes. That's exactly what I'm saying. Without proper incorporation and quorum, those fines were void. They never had standing. The crowd erupted into voices, some sharp with outrage, others trembling with disbelief. Chairs scraped against the floor as more neighbors stood, demanding answers. Marcus's face reddened as he banged the gavel again and again, but each strike only made him look smaller, desperate. Rachel shifted in her seat, her hand steady on her stomach, her expression calm but unyielding. Her presence reminded everyone of what was at stake. This wasn't about petty rules or paint colors. It was about people, families, lives. Susan Alvarez rose slowly from her chair. The room hushed when they saw her, as if everyone knew she carried pieces of the truth. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. It's true. The committee Marcus cites doesn't exist. I've been pressured to issue notices that had no legal basis. I stayed silent because I was afraid. But I can't stay silent anymore. Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair crashing back against the wall. You're lying, he snarled. This is slander. You'll regret this, Susan. But her chin lifted higher, her voice stronger. No, Marcus. The only one who should regret anything is you. You use this community as a tool for control, not care. And you hurt people. You hurt Rachel. That's not leadership. That's cruelty. The crowd broke into applause, hesitant at first, then rolling into thunder. The walls of the clubhouse vibrated with it. For the first time, Marcus's bluster was drowned out, his voice lost in a chorus he couldn't command. I stepped forward, the documents still in my hand. You've all seen the pattern, you've heard the testimony, and you know the truth now. Marcus Greer has no legal authority to enforce the rules he's wielded against this neighborhood. He's acted outside his power, and the law will not protect him from the consequences. The neighbors surged with questions, accusations, demands. I want my fines back. You threatened to foreclose on my house. You ruined our backyard garden. Their voices wove together into a roar of indignation, years of suppressed anger finally spilling into the open. Marcus stood frozen, gavel limp in his hand. The board members beside him shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. One of them, a man who had always been silent in meetings, stood and removed his nameplate from the table, setting it down with finality. I won't be part of this anymore, he said firmly, before walking off the stage. The room erupted again, louder than before. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by fear, but by outrage, and, for the first time, hope. Marcus's empire had always relied on silence, on isolation. Now the silence was broken, and the isolation was his alone. I watched him as the crowd swelled against him, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no smugness in his eyes. Only the realization that the law and the people had aligned, and he had no shield left. The confrontation wasn't just legal anymore. It was public, undeniable, final. And Marcus Greer was finished. Marcus Greer was finished, but the fight wasn't over until it was recorded in ink, sealed, and undeniable. The clubhouse confrontation had broken his grip on the community, but in my world, victory is measured by the weight of legal rulings, not applause. That's why, 1 week later, I stood in the county courthouse again, this time not in the records wing, but in the courtroom itself. The room carried a different energy than the clubhouse. Gone were the folding chairs and nervous whispers. Here, the air was thick with silence and the sharp scent of polished wood. A bailiff called the room to order as neighbors filled the benches behind me, no longer afraid to be seen standing on the other side of Marcus's shadow. Rachel sat in the front row, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her face calm but fierce. Susan Alvarez sat beside her, her folder clutched tight, her eyes steady now instead of trembling. Marcus shuffled in with his attorney, but his swagger was gone. He looked smaller under the fluorescent lights, his suit rumpled, His shoulders stooped. When the judge entered, everyone rose. I remained composed, my notes and evidence lined neatly before me. I didn't need theatrics here. The law itself would strip him bare. The case was simple: improper incorporation, illegitimate enforcement, abuse of authority. Piece by piece, I laid it out. The incomplete filings from the courthouse, the fabricated committees, the directives Marcus had handwritten, ordering targeted enforcement. And then Susan spoke, her voice steady, recounting how she had been pressured to carry out illegal notices. Her words filled the room with the kind of truth that no cross-examination could unravel. Marcus's lawyer tried to argue common acceptance, claiming the neighborhood had lived under these rules for years, but the judge stopped him cold. Common acceptance, he said, does not create legal authority. His gavel struck once, sharp and final. The ruling came swiftly. Every fine, every threat, every fabricated violation issued under Marcus's so-called committees was void. Restitution would be required for families who had paid under false authority. And most importantly, Marcus Greer was barred from serving in any governance role within the Lakeshore Estates HOA. The law had spoken, and it spoke with finality. When the gavel fell for the last time, the room exhaled. Neighbors wept quietly. Some hugged, others simply stood frozen, as though they had just walked out of a long, dark tunnel into the light. Rachel reached for my hand, her eyes wet but shining. Susan sat straighter, the burden she'd carried finally gone. And Marcus. He slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered on the steps. The lake breeze carried through the busy streets, but for the first time, it felt lighter, unburdened. People spoke openly, voices no longer lowered in fear. Parents promised their children could draw chalk on sidewalks again. Neighbors who had avoided each other out of fear of violation now lingered, reconnecting. Back home, I parked the vintage car in the driveway and stood for a moment, hand resting on the hood. The paint caught the fading sunlight, glowing like a promise fulfilled. My father had built this machine with his hands, but he'd built my resolve with his words. Keep it running, son. Keep our name intact. Tonight, I had done both. Rachel joined me, leaning carefully against my shoulder. It's over, she whispered. I shook my head softly. Number. It's just beginning. They've seen what happens when one person stands up. That won't fade. As porch lights flicked on across Lakeshore Estates, I felt the shift ripple outward. This wasn't just a victory for me or my family. It was a precedent, a reminder that even in gated communities where rules are twisted into weapons, the law is still stronger than fear. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The war Marcus started in my driveway ended here, but the legacy left behind was larger than one car, one family, or one neighborhood. It was the knowledge that when fear breaks, freedom begins.